So with that, let's get started. I'll begin by introducing Mr. Woody Hunt, Chair of the Texas Higher Education Strategic Planning Committee. Woody is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Hunt Companies Incorporated and its affiliated companies. Besides being an astute businessman, Woody is also actively engaged in civic work that impacts the local El Paso region, the state of Texas, and the nation as a whole. As part of his service on various civic, nonprofit, and professional boards, Woody has demonstrated a strong commitment to and focus on education.
I'm Bob Ferguson, former president of Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and part of the planning committee that on the strategic plan. My job here is to introduce Woody and Steve down there. But really, it's to kick off the first of the proposed goals that we have are developing in our committee. And the first one of these is the educational attainment, and you can see it up in there. And there we want to have an educated population that reflects the needs of this state as we go forward over the next 15 years. And when we talk about educational attainment and 60%, we're talking about our population that has some type of an experience beyond high school in the secondary, in the post-secondary education element. We feel that 60% is a very big reach out there, but it is also a necessity, and Woody and Steve in here will give you information that supports that particular position. You might ask immediately in here, well, where are we today? It'll knock your socks off. We're 38%. And you say, well, isn't that a stretch that's just beyond our reach in here? And then when you look at the fact that other states, New York and Connecticut and things of that are in the 50 or 50 plus in there, then you can see that, well, you know, we've got to do some catch up in here. And it's just not our feeling on this, that you can see time and time again, reports in the media and so on about how, you know, what the necessity is to keep our educational programs current and vibrant and so on. And as a consequence that, you know, this is just not our idea, it is really the public's. To give you just a quick snapshot of what the status is in Texas and why we feel so strongly about this educational attainment in here, you look at Texas over there, and what you're looking at is a dynamic move of young people going into the job market in here, and then those of us that are moving out of the job market. And you'll notice in here, our young people aren't as educated as we are. Yet you look at other countries and the country as a whole, and they are. They're moving in the opposite direction. Their young people are becoming more educated. That's our challenge right there. And educational achievement overlays really all of our particular goals. So as a consequence, that's kind of our kickoff as far as this conference is concerned. We will have two panelists in here, Mr. Whitehant and Dr. Murdoch, who will give you the background information of why this is so important. I think you will be very impressed by the insights that they have in this and why educational attainment is really a very important part of our activities. And then where you can really give your ideas and we can absorb those and consider them in the workshops that start at 11:30. This is a sequential business in here. First educational attainment, and then we go on through the other goals in here, and then we come back into the workshops. So without further ado, like to reintroduce Mr. Hunt, and away you go, Woody.
Thank you for being here today. First, I'd like to talk about Closing the Gaps 2015. And I can still remember almost 14 years ago, because I was at the regent at UT System, charged with writing the long-range plan, or supervising the writing, although I ended up writing most of it myself, the long-range plan for the UT System, and Closing the Gaps 2015 was being done by the coordinating board. So we had a lot of conversations between us, a lot of exchange of information, and I certainly, for me, began a journey which leads to today. But Closing the Gaps 2015, as you can remember, had 4 goals: participation, success, which I will call completion today, excellence, and research competitiveness. And I would think as we look at Closing the Gaps, as we look at the long-range plan 2015 to 2030, we've essentially narrowed in on number 2, on success or completion. And the reason for that is it's completion that leads to the competitiveness of our workforce. If we don't have a competitive workforce, we really don't have the resources either to support participation, excellence, or research competitiveness. I will say in 2000 there was one thing that was pretty clear, and that's that we were, as a state, it was clear to some of us, maybe not to the state or to the political leadership, but that we were in a race between our demographics and our educational attainment differences between different racial and ethnic groups. Frankly, it's a race today, as we'll see as we look at the data, that we haven't been winning. We've made some progress in closing the gaps, but we're still far from not being overwhelmed by demographic change. But let's look at Closing the Gaps 2015. The goal that was established at that time was 163,000 completions. And you remember my first comments were we're really focused on completions as a way to get to a new attainment goal. We're really focused on the workforce as opposed to some broader goals. And that was changed in 2005 to 210,000 because it was apparent at that time it was too low. We were actually at 237,000 at 2012, so we would say, well, mission completed. At the same time, totally unanticipated in 2000 was how hyper-competitive our business environment has been here relative to other states. We are, in most recent years, been bringing in about 90,000 citizens that were educated somewhere else in the world, new citizens for Texas. As you can see, most of those had a bachelor's degree or later. So, you know, a lot of new post-secondary attainment. So you would think with that we would have a workforce that was growing more and more competitive. But as Dr. Ferguson said, that is not the case, and this would suggest the goals that we set in 2000, the completion goals, were significantly too low, way too low. If you look at a chart, which is a version of what Bob showed you earlier, if you look far to the right, here's Texas, which has really been stagnant to slightly down over a 40-year time period, while the rest of the countries that we compete with and many of the states that we compete with have had really a totally different, each decade has become better educated the younger they are. And this is, to me, the data points that pointed out most starkly. The old group, the 55 and older that are in the workforce, if we viewed it ourselves as a country, we're number 3 in the world in terms of education, post-secondary attainment, education attainment. Our 25 to 34-year-olds, who should be our technologically most advanced, that new employers are making the decision on where they're going to invest based on their educational attainment, we're 24th in the world. If you look at the states, as Bob mentioned, and by the way, the certificates were not in that chart or the earlier chart he showed you. They're about 4%, so you get from 34% to 38% by adding technical certificates that are of vocational nature and are monetizable in the workforce. So you need to add 4% to this. Massachusetts is already almost at 60%. Other states like New York and Connecticut, Minnesota will be in the mid-50s. The way I view the difference between ourselves, and you can see Texas, we're down there with Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, So significantly below average, some would argue a somewhat less, and certainly less, and maybe non-competitive workforce. But it's income. The differences between our 34% and our 38% with certificates, and with certificates New York at 60, those are just dollars. They're dollars to go to complex jobs that their workforce can do and our workforce cannot. And that creates the resources to accomplish all of our other goals at either educationally or otherwise as a state. So while that's happening, while our demographics are essentially preventing us from becoming absolutely more competitive and in terms of educational attainment, and relatively less competitive, this is what's happening in the world. 65% of all new jobs by 2020 are going to require some type of post-secondary attainment. The data for Texas is 59%, which is really a signal that we already are doing jobs that require less, and so by 2020, we won't need quite as educated as the rest. So we really ought to focus on the 65%, at least in my view. So our new goal, as Bob laid out, is that we've gone through at our strategic planning committee at the coordinating board. 60% Texans, 25 to 34 by 2030 will have some type of post-secondary credential. So we focused on the younger group. The 60% has been adopted worldwide by the OECD countries. It's been adopted by the United States. They're using 2025. We're giving ourselves a little bit more time. They've also focused on the total workforce. We're focusing. So once again, we've made several concessions to really what's the adopted goal to be more realistic as far as based on where we're starting. But just like 2000, is this goal really strong enough? Here's a chart that shows how we perform against income. Educational attainment, post-secondary education attainment and income is correlated at about 80%. Alaska and Wyoming are two states that outperform their education levels. Texas also outperforms. The commonality between those three is oil and the price of oil. So if you look at this, based on education, our income levels should be below the 90th percentile. They're actually at 98%. I would argue that that's based on a world commodity, and we have to decide what kind of risks we're taking if we have a strategy that's based on that long term. So what are our barriers to achieving our goal of the 60% in 2030? It's all about demographics. If you look at our population today, birth to 24, which is where most of our education takes place, 60% in the state of Texas are either African American or Hispanic. It's the highest percentage of any state. Our K through 12 system, 65% are African American Hispanics. If you look at first grade, it's going to be 70% or more. This chart is probably the one that you need to really focus on. The Anglo population in Texas is slightly better educated than the average of the United States. As you can see, our minority population, in this case defined as Hispanics and African Americans, are significantly less, and obviously the gap we've got is much greater, almost 20% greater than the national average. It's that gap that we're talking about, and that number was in the existing population. If you look at the ratio there, it would indicate that the minority population has an educational post-secondary attainment level that's 46% of the Anglo population. So that's the existing population. This is the pipeline. Houston Endowment, Coordinating Board. It's a great data set for anyone to look at. 19.6% of our 2002 eighth graders have gone on to some kind of post-secondary attainment 10, almost 11 years later. And if you see the breakdown, between Anglos at 28%, Hispanics at 12.1%, that's a 43% ratio. So you can look at the pipeline, you can look at the existing population, the answer isn't much different, so which is a little bit disturbing. If you look at our population growth going forward, Anglo population is declining in every category except over 65 out of the workforce. African American population, about half of their growth is over 65. Over 100% of the growth is minority, and over 90% of that is Latino. So let's look at the economic barriers. If you look at the far left, the lowest quartile, this is for families that have children under the age of 17. Both the African American and Hispanics are heavily populate that. Over 42% of the Hispanics and African Americans of this state are in the lowest 25% of our income levels, way underrepresented in the higher. If you go to look at economic, just throw out gender, throw out ethnicity, just look at economically disadvantaged. 28%, if you're not economically disadvantaged, after those 11 years from being an 8th grader, 28% will have some type of post-secondary attainment. Only 9% of those that are economically disadvantaged. Go to Harris County today, you look at the pipeline. If you were an Anglo-female in 2002 in the 8th grade in Harris County, 41% chance of having higher education attainment today. If you were a Hispanic male, an African-American male, or an Anglo male, a 6% chance. So it was almost a 7-to-1 ratio. Those kind of gaps are totally inconsistent with being able to be at 60% of our 25 to 34-year-olds with some type of post-secondary attainment by 2030. The consequences, which Dr. Murdoch is, and all this data originates from him, is we'll be less educated, our income levels, inflation adjustment will be lower, our tax revenues will be less, our social safety net expenditures will be greater. Anybody can conclude where higher education will support would be under this kind of scenario. So this gets to our goals. We've talked about the attainment goal, which is the first thing that we've set. We'll have further dialogue and panels on the other 3 goals. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Woody. And if that's not enough to convince you, the next panelist certainly will. And that's Dr. Steve Murdoch. I think most of you are familiar with Steve and his work. That he's currently the Klein Professor of Sociology at Rice University, but prior to that, he served as the Director of the U.S. Bureau of Census, and from year 2007 to 2009, and therefore it was able to direct the demographic information for our entire nation. But he has served also as a state demographer for the state of Texas, and many years was with Texas A&M University, heading up the sociology, rural sociology department there, and at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Steve has a wealth of information that we are all mining as we go through this particular process. So without further comment, I'd like to introduce Dr. Steve Murdoch.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Mr. Hunt is such a good demographer. I'm not sure I have too much more to say. But I do want to make a few other additional points about where we are, because I think population growth is a big part of it. We all know that. But I think it depends on how we look at some data that comes down the line. We all know that we have been growing very rapidly, much more rapidly than the country as a whole. Everyone here knows that. That continues to be the case. We continue to lead the country in terms of total population growth. We did that in the last decade, where you see we were much greater growth even than California, which is a lot larger state than we are. And in the most recent period of time, which we have, the most recent data we have is for July 1st of 2013, you can see we grew by about 1.3 million people from April 1st of 2010 to July 1st of 2013. 1.3 million people, greater than California, which is 12 million larger than we are. So we've got a lot of population growth, which is one of the factors that Mr. Hunt pointed out that both helps us and in some cases hurts us depending upon the nature of that growth. One of the things I think to understand, and Mr. Hunt made a very good point of this, is that we are such a diverse state. Everyone in here knows that, but the extent of that diversity, I think, is sometimes lost. And here I'd just like you to look at that one column that says percent of total change. And what that says for Texas on those particular charts is that only about 11% of our total growth in Texas in the last decade was due to non-Hispanic whites. That meant that 89% was due to minority populations, 65% was due to Hispanic populations. And when you look at something probably closer to what's interesting for us, meaning that group that's coming into college, if you take the 18 and older population, you see that we had about 19% that was white, and non-Hispanic white, and about 56% that were Hispanic, meaning in total that again 80%. So what I'm saying there is we're 80% now in that population. The next group coming up is going to be even less in terms of, well, I should say, be more minority in population characteristics than the last. And it's a very pervasive. This chart simply shows in blue, this is the areas where there's growth in particular populations. This is the Anglo population. You can see that a majority of counties were actually having decline in non-Hispanic white populations, and this is the Hispanic chart. So blue there is growth, red is decline. Again, what's critical, I think, for people to understand is I can do this for Texas or I can do it for the United States, and it's looking the same. The reality of it is, I've often said that the Texas of today is the U.S. of tomorrow. I don't say that anymore because the Texas of today is the U.S. of today. We are very similar. The U.S. is very, very similar to where we are in terms of our demographics. This is the African American population. Blue is growth, red is decline. Much more mixed because the African American population growth is declining. And this is the Asian population, and those white counties, by the way, are ones that there's too few to really count in terms of numbers. So we are a diverse state. That's not something that most of you needed to be told or to learn about. But the problem we have, and the problem that really impacts our education, is not our racial and ethnic composition, obviously, because people of all racial and ethnic groups are part of our education system and can become college graduates, etc. The problem is that there is one of those big impediments to that, and that's called our socioeconomics. That is the resources that people have. And this chart, which I'll show you, I think gives a good example. Just go over to the 2010 chart and notice that percent under 2010. That's the percent of persons in poverty. And you can see that that's about 9.5% for non-Hispanic whites. But it's 27% for Hispanics, it's 25% for African Americans. So we're looking at large numbers of people with resources that are not compatible with having the resources to go on to college. And we aren't doing very well in terms of where we are now. This is the, you can look at bachelor's degree or more. You can see for Hispanics and African Americans, our largest, fastest growing groups. They said at about 11%, almost 12% of Hispanics that have a BA or more, about 20% of African Americans, compared to about 34% of non-Hispanic whites. Now, when we look at the future, I think this is important because nothing that's in our future demographically is going to make this challenge any easier. This is the projection for the state as a whole. State data center projected in the last projections we'd be about 55 million people. You can look and see that we'd have about 12 million of those citizens that would be non-Hispanic white, about 5 million that would be non-Hispanic black, about 31 million that would be Hispanic, and about 7 million or so that would be non-Hispanic Asian or other. That means that overall we'd be looking at a population that has 22% of the population would be non-Hispanic white. 78% will be a minority population member, with about 57% of that being Hispanic population. And I'm going to skip this one and go on to education. And here's the chart that I really want to talk about the most, and I'll end with, because it both has promise and this chart and the next chart. This is where we were in terms of college and higher attainment, and high school and higher attainment. And this was where we were in 1990. So if you had high school and higher, and that's the problem there, remember that can be only high school. You can see we were by 2010, we were about 60% of Hispanics had a high school degree or higher. We'll see in a long period of time, next slide, that most of that was high school, compared to non-Hispanic whites that were in that 80% category. Overall, you look at the total, the college was only about 25%, 26%, clear to the right there, and you see that the high school and higher was about 81%. This is that chart that I wanted to talk about. It is the chart based on our most recent book. And here's what I want you to look at. And of course, we look at the total. And let's look at kind of we know what we're going to have towards that 60%. If you look down at that right-hand most bottom number, that 25.9%, that'll be the percentage that we expect to have that'll have college degrees, given the way that we're going now. And let me say this is a four-year kind of college degree situation. Now, the other thing to know about that 25.9% is that particular projection was made assuming the highest rates of change that we had had in any decade period in Texas history. So that's kind of the maximum growth if you look at where we were. Now that's where we are in 2010, and then see we're 31 up there under 2030, 31.7, and by 2050 there, we actually should be, we're at about 37. Notice, and here's where I'm trying to get at, the high school and higher there is 80% in 2030, okay, 86%, and our college in 2030 or higher is 31.7%. There is a 60% between those two, okay? Meaning because what we're talking about is not 60% four-year college graduates. Our goal is 60% post-secondary education of various kinds. But it means that we would have to have a lot of our effort, if we don't change our college graduates, we would have to have a lot of change that would be related to other kinds of post-secondary kinds of events. In any case, it does emphasize that we have a tremendous challenge ahead of us. That challenge is that we've got to take of that 86% that get high school and higher, we've got to take out of that the difference between 37 and our 60, and make sure that higher is in other words, you got to take the 86, you got to take the 31 out of that, you got 50-some%, and we're going to have to get about a 30 of that 50% moved up into the category to get to be 60% of the total. In other words, we have a challenge ahead of us, and Texas needs to meet it for all of the reasons that these two gentlemen have both talked about, particularly Mr. Hunt's description, because otherwise we are going to be a state that is non-competitive. The reality of it is whether we are a competitive Texas or a run-of-the-mill state will depend upon how well we do in closing those educational gaps. And I'll just end with a couple of these slides that many of you have seen from our recent work that really says, what does it mean to all of us? It doesn't matter whether you're the one with a college degree. What does it mean to all of us? And these are charts that show in that blue column on the left is what our average household income would be, in 2010, what it was in 2010, and then all of these others are 2050. And particularly important is that red one right to the next, which shows that if we don't succeed with the kind of work we're talking about today, by 2050, Texas could have an average income that was $7,700 poorer in constant dollars in 2050 than it is today. The average household. Our consumer income could go down about $4,000 in terms of average for consumers. And our poverty rate, which is already at 17.8%, could go up to 20.9%. But if we go back and look at each of these of what they could be, if we could close those educational gaps so that everyone had the level of attainment now that we now have for non-Hispanic whites. Instead of being 66, our mean household income, if you goes clear to the right, could be that $131,000. If we closed it for mean consumer expenditures, it could go from $49,000 to $89,000 by 2050, and 2030, of course, would be in between there. And our poverty rate could drop from 17%, 0.8% to 11.9%. The point of it is, we do have a challenge here, and it is a big challenge. But all of us that served on this committee believe two things. One, that it is possible, and number two, that it is absolutely essential. Because if we fail to do this, all of the rankings that Mr. Hunt showed about where we are will continue to decline in those rankings. We are on the cusp of being an also-ran state, and meeting these challenges is critical to ensure that we continue to be the competitive Texas that we all want us to be.
We have a few minutes here that we can use to have questions from the audience, and I particularly like this part of it because I can just shift the question right over to the panelists. And I think really that one of the things that we really have to keep in mind is there's a lot of change in our society over the years, and one of them is that we have a global workforce these days, not a national one. And that's why these figures, when you looked at the other countries and how they're addressing their educational needs and so on, that information is important because those are our competitors of the future. So at this point then, I'd like to entertain any questions. I've got one right down here.
Okay. I really appreciate the look on the ethnic differences, but we're seeing a growing gap in gender in our higher education. Could you address that, please, sir?
Steve, maybe I'd flip that one over to you.
Okay. Well, I guess, one of the things I think that is, there's no doubt that that's there. And I have not seen analysis that does a very good job of explaining what's happening to our, what I sometimes call the disappearing high school males. But several years ago, it became very obvious. You could look at the data, and it was about what you would expect, about 50-50 in terms of high school graduates. And then when you looked at college freshmen, something happened to those males. Well, at one point you could say, well, they went off to the military. 20 years ago we could talk about that. But now, there's a variety of papers looking at various things that are going on, and some discussion when you look at states like Texas. Well, there's such good jobs out there in the oil field right now. The kids say to themselves, why should I bother to go to college when I can get this great paying job? But we have really not cracked the nut of why that is occurring. But it is very obvious in the data now, and it has been true now for at least 15 years of that same kind of thing happening, where it's about what you'd expect, male and female, at high school graduation, and right away in college, there are more females than males, and it doesn't get any better in many areas. Some areas it does, but it doesn't get much better when you get to graduate school. So that we do have, part of what we have is some disappearing set of males, and there may be someone who studies that in here that has a better explanation than I do.
What do you have?
And our committee has recognized that as when you move to the completion goals, which will be a later discussion today. We are calling for parity in 2030 on gender, but I think this conversation has brought to my mind that we really haven't had any testimony yet. At each of our meetings that we've had since last spring, we've tried to bring the best testimony we can bring from anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world on the subject matter. We really haven't had expertise brought to us on dealing with the gender, which each one of these is a strategy or a subcomponent. You can't get to where we want to go at 60% if you don't solve multiple issues. Ethnicity is one of them, but the gender gap is another one. So for the coordinating board staff that's here, I think that's something that we need to address in greater detail. I've also just put Dr. Murdoch's chart back, which I think shows us our policy challenges. So while I have a chance to keep it up, I'll keep it up on the screen, because it really shows the huge outcomes that are potentially possible based on how wise we make our policy decisions and our investment decisions. I'd always argue that policy ought to come before investment, but investment should not be withheld if we have high-performing policies, given the outcome differences there between a Texas that is actually has lower income levels at some very future date than it does today, and one that is highly competitive, world competitive, which is the chart that you see on the far right.
The comment I'd make is that as this process goes forward, the goals are our starting point, but beyond that, we go into targets, and targets will be part of the putting together the whole plan. And we will target things like gender and so on. And then finally, we'll come up, hopefully, with a set of strategies that will implement those particular elements. And so that's part of our process. You're getting just kind of the first glimpse at this point. We hope in the workshops we can get down into talking about some more of these details and so on. But comment well placed.
David Tischer, a member of the coordinating board, and I want to thank each of you as well as other members of the strategic planning committee. I think you're doing great work, very valuable to our board. Having said that, I'm a little concerned that we've had information given to us in testimony that 68% of entering ninth graders will graduate high school. Mr. Murdoch, or Dr. Murdoch, excuse me, your numbers were almost to 90% at age 25. Are these people that are coming and getting a GED later on? How are we getting up to that 98%? My concern is 60% may be unrealistic if only 68% of our folks are getting a high school degree. I'm not questioning that. I mean, I think that there's other ways to explain that, and I'm looking for ways to do that. Secondly, I would like you to again address the whole gender issue, because closing the gaps failed with regard to male Hispanics and male African Americans. We have not met those goals. And so we have to address that because, as you said in your presentation, they will become the majority. And it's pretty hard to get 60% if the majority are not college bound or are not attaining that advanced degree.
Well, yeah, I'm a little surprised by the 60% figures because those don't square with what we get from looking at high school graduation. But maybe they're looking at somewhat different data. I don't have an explanation for the gender gap. I wish I did. And I'm sure that there are a set of researchers out there that have looked at that. And we need to tap those, and we can tap those as our committee goes on. I simply raise it as when somebody brought it up simply because it's been obvious for so long that we're losing males of all racial and ethnic groups. This is not, just males from certain racial and ethnic groups. It is true of non-Hispanic whites. It's true for African Americans. It's true for Hispanics. That if you look at graduates from college and then from high school, and then you look at college admissions, they don't go together nationally. This isn't just a Texas issue. It's a national issue when you look at them in terms of data. So I don't have the explanation for the latter, and I'm hoping we're going to get at that in the meetings to come, but we'll get the expert in that people that are experts on that.
We need a mic right down here. Here. Mary.
I'm a fervent advocate of the closing the gaps issue, but one of the concerns that I have, and one of the issues that I haven't heard much discussion on, is that just achieving this goal is going to be a tremendous challenge. But the next challenge is, are these individuals that are getting these higher ed degrees how relevant are those degrees to the workforce needs of this state and this country? How many individuals are we going to end up with degrees that are serving at restaurants? Because I've seen them. I asked folks, and I ran into one about a year ago he had a master's degree in medieval literature. He couldn't find a job. He was in high debt. So how are those discussions moving along to tie in that specific challenge?
Well, fortunately, we have Mr. Hunt here, who that is his passion. And as a consequence, I'm going to passionately pass it on to him.
To answer the first part of the question about how realistic the goal is, from 2000 to 2013, our growth rate in completions was about 4.5% per year. What you saw here to get from 38%, including certificates, to 60% will take a compounding at 3.8% from 2013 to 2030. So in that light, we don't have to perform quite as well as what we have, and we continue to still need to be very attractive to people moving here. So that seems to put it in light that it's challenged, that it's possible, but given the demographics, which are much more complicated today than they were in 2000, it's still a huge challenge, but we think that it's possible. As far as connecting with the workforce, goal number 3 that you'll see later today is every degree, whether it's a bachelor's associate or a technical certificate or a certificate of value, has to have identifiable, marketable skills as a part of that degree. So it's a cultural and mind change that connects the workforce to the demand side to the supply side. So we need to do a much, much better job at doing that. So even if you're liberal arts graduates in English, that program needs to be responsible for identifying and helping you identify the marketable skills, and if they're not there, to include them in the program so that you can monetize. We also have another goal on student debt that tries to set a maximum goal of student debt, because the worst outcome that we've discussed is those that have that liberal arts degree that built a lot of debt and don't have a marketable skill. So it is a huge issue, and it's one, this is all about the workforce. If you, as I said earlier, moving from the 2000 closing the gaps to 2015 is about answering the question, how do we have a competitive workforce? And because we don't have a competitive workforce, everything else as a state that we want to accomplish is challenged and will be difficult to achieve. And so we have to be at world global standards in the quality of our workforce, and that means all the subcomponents, whether they're gender, ethnicity, marketable skills, all have to come together to make it work.
It's a bit of a chicken and an egg process, too, that as you recognize that if you have an educated workforce, it draws jobs into you. If you don't, then the jobs go elsewhere. So, you know, it's one of those phenomena that is a challenge to all of us. I'd like to just make one more comment about this graph over here. It's very, very important to us, because if the level of our household income drops, that means everything that's associated with that, our ability to build a road or to have social elements and so on here, it erodes as well. But if we can get it on that other path in here, then again, these are one of the attractors for people to come in, bring their jobs here, bring their organization, bring their families, and so on. So I think we got a lot at stake in this particular process. One more question over here.
In my other life, other than being a trustee at the community college, I'm a justice of the peace. I see 300 cases a week of truancy. I think your problem is most of them are male. They're not going to school. That's why you're losing them between the ninth grade going into high school, and that's why is we have to do a better job getting these kids to school every day. And that, I don't know what we can do in this room about that, but I see it every week. And I'm not a statistic guy. I just see it. And most of them come from single-parent home, Hispanic, that come to my court. And I'm from El Paso. And that's why we're losing these kids. They're not going to school.
And that's really one of the fundamental problems that we have to deal with as we look at the strategies of going from here to there and to get that element of our population better educated so that they feel that they have a future other than the life of crime. And so as a consequence, you know, it's not simply a higher ed problem. It's one that affects all of our society and certainly starts in the younger grades and so on. And we just have to view it from a global standpoint as well as taking these smaller chunks out of there. But you're right on target in here. The statistics are very vivid in that regard. One more question, and then we need to, right back there. Do not want to impinge on our next goal, because that's a pretty important one as well.
At this point, this is probably going to have to be somewhat anecdotal from you, but with the release of information from President Obama yesterday on immigration, I'm curious how you believe, if those things come to fruition, what that's going to do to the state of Texas in affecting these kinds of numbers if we continue to widely spread that door open, because that's going to affect higher ed. There was a Chronicle, article this morning on that, how that's going to really affect who we're serving. You have any thoughts on that at this point?
Well, I'll say this, and I haven't looked at the specifics yet on the immigration, but I mean, certainly who's already here is already hopefully being educated in this country so that we have competitive, notwithstanding their legal status, that we have competitive or competitive workers that are in the workforce. But the truth is the immigration out of Mexico, they're just slightly above replacement rate in terms of their birth rate in Mexico. So we're not going to see anything like we've had in the past. Now, I can't speak for the rest of the world because there's other people that might want to move here from other parts of the world. But Mexico is not going to be the issue going forward.
Yeah, I think the other thing on immigration to understand is that the record for immigrants, and it makes some sense, if you have the get up and go to try to make yourself better, immigrants have done pretty well. You know, I remember those stupid Irish. Remember those stupid Irish? They had names like Murdoch. And you know, they were able to do it. And in fact, they were able to do it because immigrants are in many cases a selective group. They're the group who really believes that they can make their life better by moving and getting involved in a new culture. I'm not much worried in terms of these numbers, and Mr. Hunt is exactly right. If you look at the demographics of Mexico, anybody who thinks we're going to get flooded, and in fact, the socioeconomics that have become quite a bit better in many parts of Mexico, I think you got to discount that. And I think the people that we have are people who wanted to better themselves, and you know, I'm not trying to condone the behavior in terms of legality. I'm simply saying that that's what's made America, is people who thought moving to America would make a better life for themselves and their children.